my gosh, this is just so amazing. Sanity in Hey dearies, welcome back to my channel, Convos with Tim. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button below to subscribe for new videos every Monday 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube. And be sure to follow the Convos with Him community over on Instagram for more content and new IGTV videos every first Monday in the month at 8 a.m. In today's video, I want to share with you guys 3 podcast recommendations that you should listen to in 2021. I have never been the podcast kind of person, honestly. I used to find a podcast so boring, just sit down listening to someone talk for a half an hour. That for me is boring. However, if it is you give me a video to watch, then yeah, I am all for that. But a podcast, no thank you. But it was last year during quarantine time when I somehow picked up this habit of listening to a podcast, and now I listen to podcasts every single day, guys. There isn't a day that goes by that I do not listen to a podcast, and I really don't remember how exactly this started, but podcasts are a major part of my daily routine. And if this is something that you don't do, or if listening to podcasts is something that you do occasionally or only when someone sends a video for you, then this habit is something that you should take up in 2021. It is honestly going to change your life. So like I said, I am going to share 3 of my favorite podcasts along with some of my favorite episodes that you should listen to. And these podcasts has really good information in relation to relationship, business, spirituality, and so much more. So let's jump right into it. So the first podcast that I want to recommend to you all is the High Earning Podcast. This podcast is hosted by Ashley Brown, who is more known as Ashley Empowers. She teaches on topics such as entrepreneurship, motherhood, finances, personal growth, and spirituality. Ashley Brown Ashley Empowers, she is also a YouTuber who I follow, and I just love her content and her vision, her brand. I love what she stands for and I love what she's about. There is no other podcast other than the High Earning Podcast that has me with my journal or a notebook and a pen just there taking notes, because there are so many good nuggets that you can receive from this podcast, or even from just Ashley's channel on YouTube. Sometimes she will have free courses on topics on relationship, business, and I know that whatever it is she does, whatever it is she is sharing, whether it be from the courses, YouTube, or this podcast, I know that it is going to be awesome revelation from God, because it's just always good material. And every time she speaks on a topic or shares something God may be speaking to her about, it's really good, and it just makes you want to apply the information that she shares to your life. And honestly, I'll say that a lot of the mindsets about relationships, business, and life in general, a lot of the mindset that I currently have now is because of her influence over the past 2 years in my life. One of my favorite episodes from the High Earning Housewife podcast is episode number 15, titled Whole Life Stewardship. So a lot of times when it is we hear the word steward, we just think about finances or money, because that's the norm when we hear that word, right? But in this episode, Ashley, she not just speaks about that aspect of finances as one area area to steward, but she shares a perspective on really taking care of your life holistically, and 7 areas that she shared that she believes that you need to steward while here on earth. And listening to this podcast, it was like, oh my gosh, this is just so amazing, and it really made me take a look at my life and the different areas that she spoke about, and then seeing how it is I could actually improve and how I could take care of this area or enhance this area of my life better and really steward what God has loaned me here on my time on earth. You guys should really check that episode out if it is you decide to check out the podcast. And just because the title of the podcast has the word housewife in it doesn't mean that it's only for females. This is for everyone. Yes, some episodes might be specifically related to females, but everyone can actually learn and gain knowledge to help make themselves better from this podcast. So the second podcast that I highly recommend that you listen to this year is the YWAM Kansas City podcast. So this podcast is from a diverse and global family that seeks to activate the next generation in their personal walk with God and reach the ends of the earth. From episodes in this podcast, you will be inspired and engaged in conversations about relevant cultural topics and what God is doing around the world. If you are someone who is into missionary work, or you like to keep up with different missionary organizations from around the world, then I highly recommend that you listen to this podcast. But aside from the ministry aspect of this podcast, there are some really great discussions in some of the episodes about topics that affect young people and youths in the current time that we are living in, and it helps you to figure out how to deal with these topics or issues from a different perspective, not a worldly perspective, just a God perspective. It's some really good discussion that is so worth checking out. So 2 of my favorite episodes from this podcast is episode number 15 titled Sanity in Social Media, and episode number 21 titled Doing Relationships Differently. Sanity in social media was a discussion about someone who was sharing how they were called to do ministry on social media. A lot of time when it is we think about being involved in ministry, we think about our churches being a part of a particular ministry, whether it be like youth ministry, women's ministry, whatever the case is, right? Along with doing missions, and for the most part when we think about that, that has to do with going to a foreign country and doing ministry there, right? But given the times that we live in, social media is a huge part of everyone's life. In all aspects of society, social media plays a really big part, and God has placed desires and passions for social media in some of our hearts. And in this episode, the young lady, she was just talking about how she always loved social media, and one of her first jobs, she used to work for this marketing, I guess, company. I can't really remember exactly, but she used to write blogs for the company and doing that whole social media marketing communication career, right? And eventually she ended up getting laid off, and she then started her own ministry on social media. So she has her own personal blog, and she was just sharing her experience about doing ministry on social media and being called to do ministry online. So if it is you're someone who love social media and you feel as if you may be called to have some sort of ministry on social media, then you should check this episode out. And the next episode, Doing Relationship Differently, was also a discussion about relationship, obviously, and the guy, he was just sharing how he did relationship differently from the world when he was looking for a spouse. I found it was a really interesting and good discussion, and it is so worth checking it out. So the third and final podcast that I want to recommend to you guys to listen to this year is the Whoa That's Good podcast. So the Whoa That's Good podcast is hosted by Sadie Lady Robinson, who welcomes you into meaningful conversation with authors, athletes, musicians, speakers, and stars from television shows in search of the answer to just one question, which is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given? For me, what I love about this podcast is how it's very conversational. So it starts off with the host asking the guests one question and seeing how the conversation progresses from there on. It's really interesting to see with each episode how the conversation just flows so naturally and where the discussion can go in that episode. It's a really good podcast, and these conversations cover so many facets of life that can be really encouraging and inspired to you. So one of my favorite episodes from the Whoa That's Good podcast is an episode titled Get Out of Your Head. This episode, the guest on this episode was Jenny Allen, who is the author of the book titled Get Out of Your Head. Now note, this is actually one of the books that I have on my 2021 wish list to read, so I really need to get that book. But anyways, so in this episode, she just talked about mentorship, authenticity, and overcoming toxic thoughts. She shared like a little insight about the book and how she was able to overcome toxic thoughts. It was a really amazing conversation, and it's one of my favorite episodes. Now, these are just 3 podcasts that I highly recommend that you listen to this year, and I will leave links to all of my favorite episodes below in the description, as well as a link to each of the podcasts. And I promise you, if it is you listen to my favorite episodes, you would not regret it. And now for today's sis quote of the day. Today's quote is actually inspired from one of my favorite episodes, and that was from the episode Get Out of Your Head from the Whoa That's Good podcast, right? And today's quote says, "Sis, instead of being jealous by what others around you are building, be about something. Create something. Go out and build something for yourself. It's time to live out what you're called to do." So guys, when I was listening to this episode, Jenny was sharing something in relation to this, somewhat sort of the words that this quote says. And I was just like, yes, like this is so good. I feel like a lot of times we can become so distracted by the things that are going on in other people's lives around us. We can become so focused and envious of what others are building. And we in ourselves have been called to do great and amazing things, but because we are so distracted and jealous and envious by other people, we cannot focus and do the things that we have been called to. And I really believe that it is time for you, for us to focus on what it is God has called us to do. Start building a legacy for yourself, for your future generation, and be about something and not focus on what others have going on in their personal lives. So guys, this brings a wrap to today's video. Leave me a comment below if it is you listen to podcasts. Leave me a comment with your favorite podcast and your favorite episode. I would love to check it out, and I hope that you all check out these podcasts that I recommend. So guys, until then, see you in my next video. Bye.